Hello and welcome to Grand Rounds for the Minnesota Regional Spinal Cord Injury Model Systems, or as we like to call it, the MINSCIMS. Thank you to everybody for joining us today for our Grand Rounds. MINSCIMS is funded by the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research, or NIDILRR, to support innovative projects and research in the delivery, demonstration, and evaluation of medical, rehabilitation, vocational, and other services to meet the needs of individuals with spinal cord injury. Next slide. MINSCIMS represents an exciting partnership among the following Minnesota institutions: Courage Kenny Rehabilitation Institute in Minneapolis, Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Regents Hospital in St. Paul, and the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis. Next slide. Our community collaborators include the Minnesota Spinal Cord Injury Association, Unite to Fight Paralysis, Get Up, Stand Up to Cure Paralysis, Paralyzed Veterans of America, the United Spinal Association, and the North American Spinal Cord Injury Consortium. This system collectively provides a multidisciplinary continuum of care for people with spinal cord injuries, including emergency medical, acute care, acute rehabilitation, and post-acute services. My name is Dr. Kimberly Mondin, and I will be the moderator of today's session. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Rehabilitation Medicine at the University of Minnesota Medical School, and I'm co-project director of the Minnesota Regional Model Systems with Dr. Leslie Morse. Next slide, please. A few housekeeping notes for today. The University of Minnesota has organized the CME for today's webinar. Please view the chat for information on how to record your attendance and claim CME credit for attending the webinar within 24 hours of the event. This meeting is being recorded and will be posted on our website. Due to the number of registrants for today's webinar, we have placed phone lines on mute to reduce audio feedback. However, we welcome and encourage audience participation using the Q&A function. If you have technical or logistical questions, we ask that you please submit those in the chat to Dan Kelly. We would also like to extend a huge thanks to all of those who work behind the scenes to make these webinars possible. Next slide, please. The title of today's presentation is Disability Identity, My Story, Research, and More, exclamation point. Our presenter today is Dr. Anjali Forber-Pratt. Dr. Forber-Pratt was appointed by President Biden to serve as the director of NIDILRR within the Administration for Community Living in the Department of Health and Human Services. Dr. Forber-Pratt also serves as the chair of the Interagency Committee on Disability Research, which exists to promote coordination and collaboration among federal departments and agencies conducting disability, independent living, and rehabilitation research programs. As a principal investigator, her expertise relates to disability identity development, and she has authored more than 40 peer-reviewed journal articles and numerous chapters. As a wheelchair user for over 35 years and a two-time Paralympian, Dr. Forber-Pratt is nationally and internationally recognized as a disability leader and mentor. Dr. Forber-Pratt was a member of Team USA at the 2008 and 2012 Paralympic Games. As a Paralympic medalist in the sport of wheelchair racing, she has dedicated her life to helping others recognize their potential. Globally, she is involved with disability advocacy efforts related to access to employment, community living, education, and sport through public speaking. She has been actively involved to help create inclusive sport opportunities for individuals with disabilities in Bermuda, India, Zambia, and Ghana. She was a White House Champion of Change in 2013, and the American Psychological Association awarded her the 2020 Citizen Psychologist Award for Advancing Disability as a Human Rights and Social Justice Issue Award. Dr. Forber-Pratt is a fellow of the American Psychological Association. We want to welcome and thank you for joining us today, Anjali. Next slide.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mondin. I really appreciate it. Well, as you heard, I'm so honored to have joined the Administration for Community Living to serve as the director of the National Institute of Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research, also known as NIDILRR. Next slide, please. I, other than being a federal employee, no disclosures to note. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. And I just want to say that I'm so thrilled to get to share some of my story here today and to talk about one of my all-time favorite topics, which is disability identity. And also just a huge thank you to our NIDILRR grantee, the Minnesota Regional Spinal Cord Injury Model Systems, for the invitation to be here today. A brief access note. Today, I am wearing a black sweater with white polka dots, and I have brown skin and long black hair that's up in a ponytail, and I have a virtual blue background with ACL's logo behind me. Not seen on camera is that I'm sitting in my manual wheelchair. And I believe that many different aspects of identities and lived experiences are really fundamental framing as to why I'm here to talk about this particular topic today. And you heard about some of those identities in the wonderful introduction. Other identities that I wear proudly include being a Paralympic medalist, an Indian adoptee, a disabled woman of color, a researcher, and an activist. I also wanted to share with this particular audience that I also have 2 degrees in speech language pathology. Nothing about my disability journey has been simple. I often say that I'm proudly one of the most complicated cases that many medical students, trainees, and even seasoned doctors learn from and with. And I feel like that really situates me well for our conversation here today. My story is maybe a little bit different than quote unquote traditional stories that you may be more familiar with from typical wheelchair users in a variety of ways. So first of all, I'm the only one in my immediate family who grew up receiving regular medical care. My parents are Christian Scientists. I also acquired my disability when I was only 4.5 months old because of transverse myelitis, with an estimated incidence between 1 and 8 new cases per million per year. So I like to say I'm 1 in a million. But it also means that I didn't have the traditional rehabilitation experience that many with acquired spinal cord injury go through, or that initial hospitalization phase, or that transition to rehab and then back to home. It didn't exist back then, but also being so young. I was adopted from India, and 2 months after arriving in the United States was when I got transverse myelitis. And both due to the severity of what was happening and because my adoption wasn't yet finalized, I was rushed to the hospital. And fun fact, I was also one of the first, possibly the first baby to get an MRI at Mass General Hospital, which eventually showed the unexplainable inflammation of my spinal cord and so forth. So even before I could talk, I was pushing boundaries and pushing even the medical community to learn something new and to figure it out. Next slide, please. But as a young child, being so young when I acquired this disability, I actually thought that everybody in the whole world had a disability and that this was just a phase that I was one day going to outgrow. I never really realized as a young kid that disabled children grow up to become disabled adults. Spoiler alert, we do. But I also thought that in order to grow up and to go to college, have a family, have a job, live on my own, do all of these different things that we aspire to, I thought that I first had to learn how to walk. And why was that? It was because I held this assumption because every adult I knew could walk. So in my mind, in order to gain access to those opportunities, I somehow felt I had to make my disability disappear. That lack of representation was tough as a young child, and it's something that I honestly think about very often as I'm leading NIDILRR. For those who don't know, but I certainly know that many in this audience are intimately aware, NIDILRR is the federal government's primary applied disability research organization, and we fund research grants that help to advance the opportunities and accommodations for people with disabilities. And as I said, we're housed within the Administration for Community Living, where our agency believes, as does NIDILRR, that people with disabilities should be able to live where they want to and to participate fully in society and in their communities. We do research on the long-term outcomes and interventions and identifying barriers and challenges. And our counterparts across the rest of the agency provide grants to states to fund programs and services. And so we complement each other extremely well. At NIDILRR, we fund the extramural research related to rehabilitation and disability, which of course includes the model systems, which Minnesota is one of for spinal cord injury. But I'm really proud to be a disabled person who's leading NIDILRR and to be that representation for others and to ensure that that representation carries forward to the work that we fund and its relevance to the broader disability community that we care so much about. We push our NIDILRR grantees to have disability representation on their project teams. In fact, this is a scored peer-reviewed criteria. And we're also pushing for those not currently represented in NIDILRR's portfolio to be. So, for example, within specifically the spinal cord injury model systems work, we've been piloting ways to include individuals with non-traumatic spinal cord injury in our longitudinal model systems database. But as I think about, a little bit more about this power of representation, I want to unpack this a little bit more. Next slide, please. At the time of being so young, the visible representations of disability were extremely hard to find in the media and in advertisements and toys and books. I'm very thankful that this is, in fact, getting a lot better. But I remember when wheelchair using Becky first hit the market. And so Becky, it was the hot commodity that everybody wanted. And then a few years later, there was even Paralympic Barbie, which coincided when the United States was hosting the Olympic and Paralympic Games in Atlanta. And she was a wheelchair racer. And these here on the screen were some of the very first toys depicting disability. And now there are many more, and they've even gotten some upgrades to more accurately depict more accurate wheelchairs and other representations of disability as well that are much more freely available. But living with a rare disability, I never fit into the regular molds and structures of accessing medical care. Even growing up in Massachusetts with some of the best care in this country, my clinical care, I was thrown into the myelodysplasia clinics alongside kids with spina bifida because it was close enough. Yet I grew up seeing the same old usual suspects, orthopedic docs or urology, working with therapy teams in terms of seating specialists and the arduous process of getting durable medical equipment. But I didn't even know that the profession of physiatry was even a thing, and that there were, in fact, board specialized doctors who specialize in people like me until I became an adult. I stumbled into discovering this because actually of my athletic journey. I had gotten more involved with what was then the Transverse Myelitis Association, now the Siegel Rare Neuroimmune Association, sharing my lived experience and perspective of growing up with transverse myelitis. And through that involvement meant meeting incredible doctors and this broader network of individuals, including physiatrists. When I reflect on just my time growing up and how I started to make meaning around this notion of my own disability identity, I grew up within walking distance of about the 8-mile marker of the Boston Marathon. And the entire town goes out to support this event. It's just what you do. It's a part of this whole marathon frenzy. And I distinctly remember being 5 years old, waking up early to stake out our spot on the curb to watch the thousands of runners go by. You get there nice and early, and I didn't really know what to expect other than that everyone was really excited about it. And it was the first time that I saw people in racing wheelchairs go flying by. And it was just mind-blowing to me. I was awestruck. I was like kid in the candy store. It was truly a life-changing moment for me. These were athletes who had disabilities, but they went to college, they had jobs, they had families. Some of them were wearing their own country name or university name across their chest. And I knew from that moment on, this was something that I really wanted to check out for myself. I wanted to become a wheelchair racer. I even dressed up on Halloween as the winner of the Boston Marathon for several years in a row. Next slide, please. I drew myself as a wheelchair racer in school projects. I was really bound and determined to make this become a reality. My parents found a Saturday sports program for other kids with disabilities that was about an hour away from my house, where recreational therapists, occupational therapists, and physical therapists had created a fun opportunity to try out all different types of sports for 2 hours each week. And suddenly doors were opening for me. And I was starting to really set my own bar and aspiration really high for the dreams that I really wanted to achieve. Next slide, please. Sports and recreation have remained a strong part of who I am even today. It was through sport that I was able to learn self-confidence and independence. There was a great deal of power in meeting kids that were like me. These kids understood that missing a day of school to spend the day at the hospital being poked and prodded was not all that it was cracked up to be. And we formed some amazing friendships and truly motivated one another. And having that sense of community was huge, not only for me, but also for my parents and siblings. It was through involvement in sport that I learned that for me, my wheelchair was enabling and empowering. It was also way faster than the clunky leg braces and crutches that came up under my armpits and were super heavy. For me, my wheelchair was freedom, and it set me on this trajectory of developing a positive disability identity with a community. And in comparison to my many friends with disabilities, sport kept me healthy and out of the hospital. For as long as I can remember, I was educating people about disability and advocating for my rights. As I share some of these, early experiences and exposures to disability, I want you to think about your early experiences and encounters with disability. What shaped your thinking about disability? What did other people say or do or talk about in relation to disability? How did these things shape your view today or your work as a professional in the rehab field or as a clinician or as a researcher in general? I remember being a first grader, and I was my big brother's show and tell project for the big old fifth grade to go up there to the middle school and to teach his classmates about living with a disability. I also have to claim that I earned him an A on that project, not that we're competitive or anything. But I also remember being embarrassed when my mother would leave notes on people's cars who were blocking the access aisle. Life with a disability is complicated, and there certainly are some days that I'm so proud of it as a part of my identity and who I am, yet there are other days when it absolutely is a source of frustration. Although I started high school nearly a decade after the Americans with Disabilities Act became law, my school was not accessible. And it was deeper than just the physical barriers. It was the attitudinal barriers and the naysayers of teachers and people in positions of power who doubted my abilities because of my disability. Unfortunately, there were many examples. Why do you want to take astronomy class? You're not actually interested in science, are you? Or when I asked to be redistricted and the superintendent told me that sometimes life was tough and that you just have to deal with it. Or the English teacher who sat in front of my class who had to walk down a flight of stairs to the accessible portion of the building. Why are you in an honors level English class? It's not like you can go to college anyway. Or the gym teacher. Sorry, Anjali, you're a danger to the other students. You may no longer participate in gym class. But I sure would love to show them some Paralympic medals and other such things now. But I share these experiences because, unfortunately, even in 2023, many of these things still happen to the patients and the young people that you work with and affects them and their families. The experience of growing up with a disability is different from acquiring it. One is not easier than another, and the impacts and the experiences are just different. But growing up with a disability also means a lifetime of these encounters of ableism, often before you even have the brain development to fully process them. And I feel like for me, this is one of those pivotal moments that has stayed with me and truly has shaped me into the leader that I still am even today. I will say that these experiences also exhausted my mother, who was my primary advocate from the time I was first assessed by the school district for early intervention services until I took the baton and hired my own lawyers at age 14 to take on my school district in federal court. Next slide. College was an entirely different experience for me. As I did take on my school district in federal court, I then ended up at the University of Illinois, which celebrates disability as diversity and provides many opportunities for disabled students to thrive. I was really enamored with this new life where I didn't have to fight for basic access to take a class, let alone participate in extracurriculars, that I stayed for 3 degrees. And my research, as you heard, was able to focus on specifically on disability identity development. And that is really being able to dive into how individuals develop a disability identity and make meaning of their disability experiences. And we're going to come back to that here in a little bit. But with such a focus on my lawsuit in high school, along with various other injuries, I had almost given up on that childhood dream of Paralympic success. But being in such an inclusive and accessible university was wonderful. And ultimately, it was that environment that also led to making my first national team in 2007. And boy, what an honor it was to wear Team USA gear representing our country on the world stage in front of 91,000 fans. Next slide, please. Not all kids with disabilities are fortunate to know that the Paralympics exist, but I was so fortunate that I did. And in fact, my Canadian grandmother would mail videos of coverage from Canada, and so that I could be able to see what was happening in the Paralympic movement. And for many individuals, they stumble into this much later in life, not as a young child, because of struggles to access adapted sport or recreation in their home communities, or struggles to see this in more mainstream media. Again, this is slowly evolving and changing, which I'm so grateful for. But we also know from research, next slide, that people with disabilities who are involved in adapted sport and recreation in their communities are more likely to feel included and empowered in their communities, more likely to connect specifically with mentors and peers with spinal cord injury, more likely to hold a steady job, to have a positive disability identity. And as I said, even from my own experience, to have less secondary health complications or hospitalizations. Next slide, please. So with this kind of overarching framing of my story in mind, I also want to talk a little bit about some models of disability. So models of disability are common frameworks that are used to talk about disability, and they also tell us a really important history as well. The medical model of disability centers on the impairment itself, and that crux of that model is really the perception of disabled individuals by the non-disabled majority, meaning that oftentimes the voices and opinions of people with disabilities are often not included, but are rather more minimized by the viewpoints of the overarching dominant culture. And this mindset is still very prevalent in many educational processes, systems, and deeply embedded in medical education training modules. The embodiment of that medical model of disability gets reinforced when assumptions are made that due to a disability that you can't be fully included alongside peers or seen as capable. Whether it's intentional or not, it's that type of ableist assumption that actually works against promoting a healthy disability identity. As a whole, prevailing constructions of disability have tended to focus more on the negative aspects of impairments like pain, muscle weakness, inability to complete specific tasks, or difficulty breathing. These aspects of disability often elicit fear and discomfort among those who are non-disabled. And so the very notion of celebrating a disability identity can seem kind of strange to many outsiders. I also want to make a really important point that I also understand as clinicians, some of this is your job to dig into those symptoms and those aspects of impairments. But we also have to find a way to counterbalance it, and to be able to really be able to encourage a healthy development of a person's identity as well. So the two models here on this slide that support disability identity development more prominently are the last two. And so these are both the diversity and human rights model of disability and the disability justice model. And with both of these particular models, disability identity becomes an important layer to this conversation, and it really is something about it's celebrating disability as a form of diversity. And I believe that as we as society start to celebrate these experiences and to engage with individuals with lived experience of disability, to learn more about the encounters with ableism and to normalize these conversations and so forth, these experiences are valuable to better understand this overarching context of barriers and challenges. But also from a research standpoint, it allows us to then better intentionally design and conduct research and research policy to avoid perpetuating ableism or silencing certain voices. So, as I think about, what does this all mean, and how have I gotten to this space as a disability identity scholar? Like many, my professional and personal career trajectory has been a little bit circuitous. But I also feel like it's important to note that for a long, long time, as I was going through graduate school and even as an early career faculty member, for a long time, I tried to separate out my disability from my work. But it was mentors who really challenged me to bring the two together, bring my lived experience and passion for advocacy to allow that to deepen the research that I was engaged in. And now being able to see, taking those elements and really having that be intertwined with my own disability identity woven into the research, and more recently leading NIDILRR, we're working to shape the federal disability research agenda. this beautiful melding really allowed for greater depth and breadth of this work. And so it really did take individuals challenging me to push that together as I embarked on this journey of studying disability identity. Next slide. Actually, next slide as well. So disability identity can be described as this sense of self that includes one's disability, as well as feelings of connection to or solidarity with the disability community. And a coherent disability identity helps individuals not only to adapt to disability, but also navigating those daily stresses and hassles and encounters with ableism, like what I was describing. Disability identity shapes the way that individuals see themselves, their bodies, their interactions with the world around them. And people with disabilities not only have to navigate those physical components of their disability, but also the social meaning that's attributed to that disability. And so it really is the combination of these physical aspects and the social aspects that come together to form a person's disability identity, which also must be considered in relation to other identities, such as LGBTQ status, racial identity, cultural identities, and independent of other aspects of identity too. So we have to honor disability identity as its own thing, as well as in relation to these other identities. But I want to point out a couple interesting layers to consider with disability identity development. When you think about racial identity development, for example, unless you're adopted like me, most of the time, an individual has someone who shares that racial identity somewhere in their immediate nuclear family. But disability identity is more similar to LGBTQ plus identities in that individuals with disabilities often don't have somebody who shares that same identity within their nuclear, orbit. Of course, there are some exceptions with certain genetic disabilities, but more similar to LGBTQ populations, people with disabilities have to find that community first. And I really wanted to, as a scholar, to be able to better understand the experience of disability and developing a disability identity to figure out down the line, how could we tailor our interventions to better support disabled people? How do you know when a person is struggling with their disability identity? Is there a difference between being born with a disability versus acquiring it later in life? Is disability an antidote to ableism? And if so, how do we foster or nurture or grow that? What makes it so that a person, ends up having a strong disability identity versus another? These were some of the many, many questions that I really sought to answer with my own line of research. Next slide, please. So over the course of, I guess it's been over a decade now from when I started down this path. We started off with a systematic literature review, and we learned, lo and behold, disability identity was relatively understudied in comparison to other social identities. And the literature mostly focused on adults. And so I have to say, too, that I was pretty dismayed that of the 41 empirical studies on disability identity, so first of all, I was also only focused on studies that actually included data from participants with disabilities, because there was also a lot of studies that did not, which was very interesting. But I was dismayed that of those 41 articles, that only 9 had a sample size of more than 100 participants. But I'd like to remind you all that there are 67 million Americans with disabilities in the United States. So that was a little bit disorienting. Then we conducted a series of studies to both provide us with a framework for the key components of disability identity, with the ultimate goal of developing and validating a measure on disability identity development. Because in order to answer those earlier questions that I was pointing out, you needed a measurement tool in order to do that. And I will also fully admit that I am not a psychometrician, but I had the pleasure of being able to build an excellent team with individuals who were, thank goodness. But a lot of this initial qualitative work really helped to provide the framework and the grounding, which then led to that later psychometric work for the other studies that are listed here on this slide. Next slide, please. So our framework has been refined a bit over time and views disability identity as a unique phenomenon that shapes the individual's ways of looking at themselves, their bodies, and how they interact with the world, as I said. And there are things that include both internal components in terms of how you're thinking about disability, as well as some more, external components of how you're outwardly engaging with the community. And importantly, these we described as statuses, not stages. So this is not a linear model, but really there's intentional fluidity because this is messy and it's complicated, and there's a lot that does depend on the context and on the individual, and also an individual can have more than one disability. So and we're going to get to that here in a little bit as well. So in terms of the internal beliefs about one's own disability and the disability community, this is the degree to what degree disability is a part of who a person is. What are those feelings of connection or relationship to other people with disabilities? And this being an internal piece is a little bit more passive, but it's not just about beliefs of yourself, but of that broader community. And this was a really new concept for the field to consider, both an internal component as well as external factors playing a role in shaping this identity, which to me, intuitively, it makes sense. But others had really kind of parsed those out as separate things. So some had studied things like beliefs in general about disability, but not tied specifically to you yourself, as an example. The next status is around anger and frustration with disability experiences. So as I was sharing with some of my own experiences, that internal frustration or wrestling with negative aspects of Owen's disability, wow, this was really important to find. And this also remained being statistically important on our later work that was measuring this. We often think of disability identity as only being a positive thing, but these negative experiences, the frustrations like the hardships that I shared from my own story, they matter. Adoption of disability community values. So this is like sort of the strengthening of that connection to the core values of the disability community of activism and combating ableism. And then contribution to the disability community. So giving back to the disability community in some sort of outward way through engagement or service. And with this framework in mind, we did, as I said, eventually develop and validate a measure. Next slide, please. And so this is a 35-item measure of disability identity that leads to a SCIMS score of a person's total disability identity, which again reflects the salience of an individual's disability identity at that given point in time that they're filling out this measure, but captures both the internal and external dimensions. And for us, that it made sense that it was a total SCIMS score because disability identity is complex and it is more than simply a sum of its parts. And so really each of these different components can be thought of as essential pieces of a puzzle that once completed represents a person's disability identity. I do think that this score provides clinicians, psychologists in particular, counselors, and individuals with a starting point of where a person is at in terms of having or acknowledging their disability identity. When we went back to reanalyze our data based on this, and while I will say these analyses are still underway because I'm not able to engage in this type of scholarly work while I'm in my current role, but I'll share a little bit of what we know. In terms of a person's disability identity, what we found is that if you were born with a disability or had acquired a disability for 10 or more years, you perform the same. Which again, intuitively, we all thought that to be true, but it was really exciting to see this from our data. And we are also more deeply exploring more about the impacts on disability identity based on the duration of disability in some of the other buckets of length of time of having disability, and also the visibility of disability, which I'm going to talk about here a little bit next. Because this scale is focused on adults, we also conducted in parallel some qualitative interviews with 24 adolescents, because I didn't want to make the assumption that the adult framework was in fact applicable to children and adolescents. And so what we found, next slide, going back to that original framework was that for adults, they were able to negotiate that internal and external outwardness with the disability community more adeptly. And that for adolescents, there was a lot more tension between this internalization and externalization of disability. And we also found that that context was it really mattered in a different way than it did for adults. Next slide, please. And these two quotes here on the screen really show that tension and sort of that give and take. And it made perfect developmental sense to us as well. We found that disabled adolescents, they seem to have this running stream of consciousness with this active negotiation that is dependent on context and more complicated by teenage relationships and things like hormones and all of that. We also found that disability identity saliency differed depending on the environment and the activities that the adolescents were engaged in. So whether they were in the physical school building versus at wheelchair basketball practice, for example, like that mattered. The really interesting part with this adolescent data was that we also asked them if there was a magic pill with no side effects and it would take away your disability, would you take it or not? And this was modeled off of one of the questions that is actually in the adult scale, but we used it really as a conversation starter with the adolescents, and it led to quite a bit of rich discussion and variability. So very interestingly, next slide. If the adolescents had an apparent disability, overwhelmingly they would not take the magic pill. Yet, if the adolescents had a less apparent disability, next slide, please, we see the opposite, and that they would take the magic pill. And if they had a less apparent if they had both visible and hidden disabilities, next slide, please, they were very much undecided. But many of them explicitly said they would like to get rid of their less apparent disability, but they were okay with the physical or the more apparent disability. And this really raised questions as to why society seems to support and promote the development of a healthy disability identity for those with apparent disabilities, but for those with less apparent disabilities, we have not. But we really did find, that disability identity is very much on their minds. And yes, we need more longitudinal research to really explore this and to see what this looks like at earlier ages too. But this is really something that we should be considering. Next slide, please. There's a growing amount of more research that exists on this topic, and there's a lot of variability about the perception of one's disability identity. And so this slide really shows differences in terms of what that variability looks like, and how different, whether it's specific disability groups or differences of growing up with a disability versus acquiring, and it just shows the fluid nature too of how people's own perceptions of their identity changes and evolves over time. So as with this in mind, this next slide really does show a little bit more of that diving into that consideration of growing up with a disability versus acquiring it later. And I believe that this is really important for us to zero back in particular from the context of the world of rehabilitation. So much of the clinical picture here, we talk more about sort of the transition from pediatric care to adult care, for example, but we also need to acknowledge that there are differences in disability identity and how that's shaped for those growing up with a disability versus acquiring it later, and that we need to continue to support this in a person's overarching development. So if you're working with children or young adolescents, if we're overemphasizing normalizing function, that may serve as a detriment to developing a positive sense of self and well-being, even if it's unintentional. And the rehabilitation care from childhood may not meet those long-term care needs as things change and evolve. And as I shared from those data, stigma certainly remains a significant problem, and it can also shape how you're viewing and constructing your own sense of identity. Next slide, please. From our adult study, these are 2 quotes from our study with college-age adults with disabilities who both either had a disability from a young age or acquired as a child. And so these, illustrate some differences and also hints at something that I also can't wait to dig into studying too, in particular with the second quote there, which is, I really would love to dig into the disability identity processes that parents and caregivers and siblings also go through. I believe that there is a parallel process, and it may look similar, but I think I think that it is fundamentally different than the process that the person with the actual lived experience of disability goes through. But we need to study it, and we need to learn more about it as well, as that quote really begins to touch on. And so, I believe that stories like mine and of patients and their lived experiences are essential to helping this field really move forward. And I also believe that there are some tangible clinical implications that can help to, promote or foster more conversations about disability identity and to chip away at those stigmas and ableism that I experienced and that others experience. These are things that we can do to help to promote the building of community and bridging that gap for somebody who perhaps is struggling to find their people. Next slide, please. And so, it can be looking for intentional ways that you can be validating of the people that you're working with, of their disability experience, because this can help to then instill confidence and pride. So a few suggestions of kind of what those implications could be, or what those tangible things could be, are on this next slide. So including accurate disability representations in the waiting room materials, or that maybe that are developed by your organization. Next slide, please. So this, we have to educate our media and marketing colleagues about the diverse representations of disability to really reflect, not all with spinal cord injury are manual chair users. Some might be using an eye gaze tracker to drive their mobility. Some might also have attached alternative augmentative communication devices. We can't forget about those in the SCI community who ambulate. So often when we think about what those visual representations are, we tend to privilege certain representations of disability or of SCI over others. It's also, important to demonstrate allyship in certain ways through modeling behaviors and also constantly learning. I mean, having conversations like we're having here today, being in this field of rehabilitation and all of the many interdisciplinary fields that rehab touches, we're responsible for fostering inclusion and promoting disability identity in positive ways. These are 2. The next 2 slides are 2 activities that many from the rehabilitation psychology world have been able to use and adapt and really can serve just as conversation starters that you could engage with patients or families to start talking about this thing called disability identity. And I've used this in workshops and small groups as well as individually with individuals. Next slide. And so this is a more wordier version of the previous activity of where is it as you're thinking about your many different identities, where does disability actually fall on this? Next slide, please. And as I reflect on the important elements of allyship, again, as rehabilitation professionals, I believe that we must value and honor the insights and participation of all disabled community members, and to really work hard to break down that stereotype to make sure that we're not privileging certain voices over another. And so this is really about embracing cross-cultural disability solidarity and checking our own internal disability related biases. So first and foremost, disability service providers with disabilities are not immune from our own internalized and preconceived notions of disability. So this is both for service providers with disabilities and without. We all have to check our internal disability related biases. And then this next slide has, just straight up conversation starters where you may be able to encourage, conversations that you could engage in, and of how you might start a conversation about this thing called disability identity. And again, this is not meant to be exhaustive, but if this is a brand new conversation, here are some pieces that can really help. And I would be remiss as the director here of NIDILRR to also not say that, I hope that you consider NIDILRR for future proposals, as we do fund work across the lifespan and are actively interested in these topics that I've shared about, as well as much more. We have a broad depth and breadth of responsibility to meet the needs of all 67 million Americans with disabilities. Next slide. And so this includes, not just the spinal cord injury community, but also co-occurring disabilities. It includes, it includes all aspects of the lifespan as well. We do tend to organize across three main domain areas of health and function, employment, and community living and participation. And we know that there's so many wonderful and important research questions that exist out there that we still need to learn about how people with disabilities interact with the world around us, whether that's personal factors, societal factors, or environmental factors. Next slide. One of our largest mechanisms to note is our field initiated projects. And I'll just say that across NIDILRR's portfolio, we really have adopted the approach that it is up to the applicant to make the case for what should be studied and what gap it fills. And it is intentionally broad because we can't possibly predict all of the research needs of what was shown on the previous slide of our broad depth and reach and responsibility. So I hope that you will consider NIDILRR for future funding. Next slide, please. Oh, that did not format well. Well, I can put this here in the chat. So this is just a few links to learn more about NIDILRR, to sign up for funding opportunity announcements. And if you are interested in being a peer reviewer, that's also a great way to learn more about NIDILRR funded projects. And then I want to just end on a really fun note, which is, as I tie this back together, next slide, please. Representation matters. And these are some of the many more books and toys and so forth that do exist. And you all in your professional roles can help to foster disability identity development with those who you work with. Your work matters, and you help to make our society more inclusive. And, as we see with these particular toys and books and materials, I just truly love that these do exist. And I wish that I could go back to little Anjali and show her all of these neat toys, but I leave that up to you to do with the future little Anjalis in your lives. And I really do hope that you will, and that you will continue to talk more about disability identity with your peers and with your colleagues. And so with that, I will open it up for questions.
Thank you so much for an excellent and authentic presentation today, Dr. Forber-Pratt. And at this time, we invite anyone to ask questions through the Q&A mechanism in Zoom. So any questions for Dr. Forber-Pratt, go ahead and put them in the Q&A. Quiet group. It's interesting to see so I do work in the area of appraisals of injustice, I think, as you know. Sorry, that's my dog in the background. And when we were doing interviews, talking about how people think about their injuries in terms of blame and unfairness and severity and irreparability of loss, the theme of stigma came up. And it was particularly among those with non-apparent disabilities. So this was among people with spinal cord injuries. So it was people who were walking, and they really felt like they were being judged by the outside world because they didn't understand their disability. And it was a lot of men actually who were saying, I'm not helping my wife carry the bags from the cart into the car, and so I get looks from other people. And so that's interesting how all of these constructs are sort of intersecting.
For sure. For sure.
Yeah.
And it to me, it raises the questions too of how are those different elements being perpetuated or reinforced in society, and then how can we break that down, right? And so so naming it is absolutely the first hugely important step, but then how can we break down those ableist assumptions so that an individual doesn't develop that perception on themselves and so forth.
How important do you think connection to the community is
Hugely
in developing
important.
disability identity? So
Yeah.
what can we do as professionals to help, when people are newly injured and going out into the community, what can we be doing?
Yeah. So, I mean, what we see from the research is that connection to the disability community is huge. However, we also know that you have to meet people where they're at, and I hear this time and time again, especially for those that are in acute rehab, where it's striking that balance of when is too soon or when is it not going to be met with met with open arms, and so to speak, because there's it's also such an overwhelming time, of course, for individuals. What I believe is really helpful, it's like helping to explain how could you make those connections when you are ready, and sometimes there's ways of in by having, whether it's speakers or presenters or, hosting a disability sports clinic day that just happens to be happening in the hospital. And like, oh, you might be, you might stroll by that on your way to the therapy gym or what have you, where you sort of start to plant the seed of it for somebody that is more hesitant and maybe is not ready to engage with a peer mentor, for example, or and so forth. But then certainly in discharge materials and so forth, being able to provide options of how they can build and find those connections is really important. And then following up too, I mean, like as folks are transitioning from inpatient, is it something that can be carried forward in outpatient conversations as individuals are transitioning to that level of care?
Right. Thank you. Any other questions? I could keep asking questions all day. Do you think it's something that has to happen organically or something that could be an intervention?
So I think that's where I think we still need a little bit more research, like, because I would love for there to hopefully be an intervention and to be able to say like, hey, like this is, the sweet spot of both the, the timing piece and also like, based on where you're scoring, maybe there's a point of, hey, you're scoring at this level and like, hey, that means you're ready for these conversations. I don't know. But I think that we just, this is still such a new field and discipline that I don't have a great question yet. I would me personally, I would love for us to get to that point of there being, an intervention and in terms of, being able to better assess with the data and with, input from the individual of assessing sort of readiness, if you will, to engage.
Right. Thank you. I do see
There's a great question that just came in,
yeah.
So it's is it important to have a physical connection with the disability community, or does virtual connection have the same impact for someone who's newly disabled? I love this question, and I should have mentioned this too. So we were really, really intentional, in particular when we were talking about and studying the aspects of engagement with the community, so that contribution to the community and so forth, that yes, we found that both physical engagement as well as virtual and other forms of engagement were equally beneficial, and for some individuals, like and some of that is also like who's an introvert versus an extrovert, right? For some people, physically going out is not how they want to engage with anyone, let alone the disability community. And so we really got a lot of wonderful input from individuals, for example, where they were engaging in social media communities, or they were engaging with, like, maybe their contribution was creating like TikToks, or creating, or also in like writing blogs, or like reading disability, blogs or books and things like that. So we did find that both types of connection really did matter. And again, I think we need more research to really be able to concretely quantify that and to say that. But I can say in the items on our scale, we were intentional about, we didn't want that engagement to only be physical in-person engagement. And this was all before, COVID land and all of this, the world had changed. So I would be really interested to see kind of if that has continued to hold true, which I believe it probably would have.
Thank you. All right. Amanda, do you want to throw up that last slide? Thank you. So again, I'd like to thank you, Dr. Forber-Pratt, for your presentation today and taking the time out of your day to present at our grand rounds. And I would like to thank all of our attendees as well for joining us today. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to Dr. Forber-Pratt directly, and I'm sure she would be happy to answer your question. The recording for this webinar will be posted on the MinSCIMS website soon with a link to our YouTube channel. And as a reminder, please see the chat for information on how to obtain CME credit for attending today's webinar. At the end of the webinar, a brief 3-question survey will pop up. We would really appreciate your feedback. It helps us know what topics people would like to hear about in the future. And we also hope you can join us for our next grand rounds, which will be Thursday, February 1st in 2024. Sounds crazy to say that. At noon Central Time, where Dr. Jane Duff, Lucy Grant, and I will present Hidden Battlefields, Anxiety and Spinal Cord Injury and Disorders. So thank you all again, and have a great rest of your day.